Good afternoon and welcome to session 1 of the Nature Repair Market webinar presented by the Alluvium Foundation. My name is Ian Rutherford. I'm the chair of the Alluvium Foundation, which is a new not-for-profit entity associated with the Alluvium group of companies. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and people are joining us today from all over Australia. And we recognise the continuing connection of those traditional owners to land, waters and culture, and pay our respect to their elders, past and present. First, some context for today's webinar. We've all seen the explosion in interest in water and carbon markets and how they're contributing to environmental protection and repair. In 2022, the COP15 Summit released a Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which released a series of goals and targets and brought biodiversity really into the same framework as carbon in particular. Those goals included 30% of threatened and endangered species protected, 30% of degraded lands repaired, and $200 billion US a year invested in achieving those goals. But it was recognised at that meeting that we can't rely on governments alone to achieve these goals. We have to have private investment. And that private investment has to be regulated by the market to some extent. Responding to that, the Commonwealth released in 2022 a Nature Positive Plan. And part of that plan was a Nature Repair Act released in 2023 to establish a biodiversity market for Australia. And this is the first government-sponsored biodiversity market in the world. So it's really important for everybody in Australia involved in the environment area, and lots of interest in that, and hence today's seminar. There's a huge appetite from investors, governments, NGOs, community groups in how markets can help to achieve the ambitious goals that were set at COP15. So today, in the first of our 2 seminars, we have a focus on the nature repair legislation. And the first speaker on a government perspective on that legislation is Tony Mott from the Commonwealth Department. The second is an international context for biodiversity investment with Laura Waterford from Pollination. And the third speaker today is Gillian Button, a lawyer with Allen Linklaters, who will give us a legal perspective on this complicated space. The regulation of the legislation falls to the Clean Energy Regulator, and we're fortunate to have Carl Binning talking about their perspective. Next Wednesday, in the second of these webinars, we'll have 3 speakers focusing on the challenges of nature repair markets in general. So a bit broader. And we're going to talk about risks, opportunities and net outcomes with Dr. Megan Evans, an ecological perspective with Associate Professor Patrick O'Connor, and finally, the challenges of biodiversity markets in general with Dr. Neil Byron. Our first speaker today is Tony Mott from Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. Now, unfortunately, the first 2 slides of Tony's talk weren't recorded, so I'll just go over those before Tony starts speaking on the 3rd slide. These are the topics that Tony has covered today. 6 topics: why a new environmental market is part of the Nature Repair Positive Plan, broadening interest from the business and corporate sectors, overview of market design for the new legislation, what will people actually be investing in, how the arrangements in the market will work, and finally, the indicative timing, next steps, and potential evolution of that market. Now, Tony made the point that the legislation we're talking about is just one part of the Nature Positive Plan released by the Commonwealth in December 2022. That plan sets out the government's commitments to better protect, restore, and manage our unique environment. It notes that private sector investment can make a significant contribution to repairing and protecting our environment, and that the legislation, the nature repair market legislation, is only one part of that nature positive plan. Now, that plan aims to deliver better environmental protection and laws that are nature positive, to speed up decisions and make it easier for companies to do the right thing, and finally, to restore integrity and trust to systems and environmental laws. Now over to Tony.
Through three major consultation exercises in late 2022, we consulted on the underlying policy options. Early 2023, we consulted on an exposure draft of the legislation that was introduced to Parliament in March 23. And that legislation was delegated to a Senate committee pretty much automatically at that time. So we went through an inquiry from a Senate committee for much of 2023 with the negotiations to finalise the bill and associated amendments to the ENGA legislation. They started with a bit of enthusiasm in late November, December, with the result that the Nature Repair Bill was actually passed by Parliament in early December. It received royal assent on the 14th and came into effect on the 15th of December. Since then, we've been very busy building the elements of the market. Now, I need to be quite clear here. The government is establishing the parameters for the market. The government is not the market. The market will be the sum of the interactions between buyers, sellers, and intermediaries. So under our current approach, government is not a buyer in the market. It's not a supplier in the market. It's not a risk taker in the market. It has set the parameters. So the legislation is, thank you. Legislation is obviously a very important element. The Nature Repair Act sets the umbrella parameters for the scheme, but it relies on a series of subordinate legislation which comes in to fill in the gap, so to speak. And we are working on that subordinate legislation right now. So the slide at the top refers to the nature repair rules, the biodiversity assessment instrument, and some methodology determinations, which are supporting legislation that underpin the Act. So we're working on those right now. And I should have said earlier, because of probity reasons, there may be some questions I'm unable to answer today because we're still working on policy. We're still working through some procurement exercises, and I know we've got procurement activity coming up. So if some questions kind of stray into an area where it would be unfair or inappropriate for me to answer, I'll let you know. But the legislation sets the parameters, but we have the advantage of gaining independent advice through two formal mechanisms. One is an expert reference group on how to assess biodiversity changes in a variety of systems, habitats, ecosystems. And then there is a statutory nature repair committee whose role is to advise the minister on some key recommendations before the minister makes some legislation. As part of that exercise, once a project is formed and an application submitted to the Clean Energy Regulator and approved, there is a register where Joe Public can look up the nature of projects, where they are, what they're trying to achieve, who's involved, those sorts of details. A successful project that delivers a lasting, sustainable, resilient improvement in biodiversity is then entitled to apply to get a biodiversity certificate, which is a notional thing. It's not a certificate that you'd put on the wall of your office. It's an electronic record in a register that the CER will maintain. But it's tradable personal property, separate from the underlying project area, separate from the land tenure, and ownership of that certificate allows the owner to make claims about the project. So whether they have restored a sensitive area, whether they've expanded it, whether they've improved conditions to the extent that the area can recover. So examples might be dealing with invasive species, removing those sorts of stresses from the system. It might include tree plantings. It might include a combination of those things. I'll go into those a little bit later. But in order to make sure the certificate has some integrity, there needs to be a high level of monitoring and compliance. Did the project actually do what it set out to do? So monitoring compliance will focus on both activities Did you put the fence in? How many seedlings did you put in? Did you restore the tidal flows? All those sorts of examples. That's activity-based reporting, but there's also outcome-based reporting, as in to what extent has biodiversity improved? Is it statistically significant? Can we rely on the claims being made by the project? I'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Ian. So the hook, if you like, is that the certificate has value, and it's the willingness of people to buy the certificate that provides the finance to run the projects. So the question is, so what will people be investing in? What does the certificate represent? Well, they are tradable personal property, and they will have a value based on whatever the market ascribes to them. And how the market approaches that question kind of depends on their motivations. And I've just listed a handful of motivations at the bottom of the page. Throughout our consultation, there were those who were approaching this from a philanthropic point of view. And this is the right thing to do. We want to restore culturally and environmentally sensitive areas, protect endangered species. But then there are a whole suite of others who are looking at this as a purely financial investment, and others who are thinking of it as potentially a marketing opportunity. You know, their organisation may have large impacts on nature, or their supply chain does, and they're looking to protect their social license, perhaps even to attract a sustainability premium, you know, in terms of their company valuation, whether that's a publicly listed company or private. There's a whole range of motivations that we've picked up through consultation. And I think how you approach the question of, is this a good investment, kind of depends on your motivation. Next slide, thanks, Ian. So the market design is based on projects being run which deliver a sustainable and resilient biodiversity improvement. But those projects have to apply an approved method, similar to methods approved under the ACCU scheme. You can't just do whatever you want. You need to work within parameters. So there will be a series of methods developed and approved by the minister that projects can apply. Those methods will be very specific to certain ecosystems, and we're working on those right at the moment. So I'm limited to what I can say about them, but the scheme does allow for projects to run in terrestrial ecosystems, inland, coastal, and marine waters. So we've gone as broad as we can. And when the market commences, it's natural that there'll be interest in some methodologies more than others, some areas more than others. So whilst it's a national scheme, the take-up might be a bit patchy around the country, so to speak, because the market may decide that they are more interested in certain areas, high rainfall rainforest or rangelands, or restoring areas that are badly degraded. The market will decide which projects get up. Successful projects that are on the pathway to delivering the biodiversity outcomes or can demonstrate they already have will be entitled to a certificate. So they would apply to a regulator with their argument and all of their monitoring and auditing reports and say, we believe we have demonstrated we have delivered a lasting benefit. And if the regulator agrees, they'll be issued a certificate. Okay, the next one, Ian. Okay, this is my last slide, and this is an indicative timeframe. So the Nature Repair Act was passed in mid-December last year, and the minister is on the record of saying in around 12 months after the act is passed, she would like the scheme to commence. So I'm coordinating a branch within our department and working with the Clean Energy Regulator on delivering all the bits and pieces that need to happen. And for a complex project like this, you can imagine that certain things need to start before others, certain things need to finish before others, and that's my day job. On that timeframe, I've indicated where April 24 is along the timeframe. So we've just established the Biodiversity Expert Reference Group, and we're working our way through establishing the Nature Repair Committee. So arguably we're about a third of the way there against the timeframe. That's a little bit misleading because some tasks are obviously harder than others. And a number of the things we are doing are quite innovative and never been done at the scale we're talking about now. So just because the timeline suggests we're about a third of the way there, it doesn't confirm that the rest of it will be an easy run for us. So indicatively, we're hoping to give the Minister what she wants within 12 months of the Act being passed, but there are still many hurdles to overcome before we get there. I think I will stop there for now. The Clean Energy Regulator is an implementation partner for us. So they are a separate organisation. There are 7 work streams in the branch that I work in, and we are viewing the Clean Energy Regulator's contribution as another work stream. So they're very much a delivery partner for us, working closely with us, hand in glove. In fact, I've spoken more to the CER staff this week than I have to my own staff. So we're that closely embedded, as we should be, given that the Clean Energy Regulator's role in supporting the market moving forward. Right. I don't know how we're going for time, Ian, as to whether there's room for questions now or whether we park it for later.
We've got time for questions, Tony. And thanks very much for that. Here's the contact details for Tony to register your interest in this and to contact the Nature Repair market team. So we've got a lot of questions online, Tony, and I'll just ask a couple of those. The first one is, will the slides be made available? They will be made available to everybody. There a question here from Liz Davis. There is one certificate issued for the life of the project. How will project proponents ensure they value the certificate appropriately to ensure it funds project activities, monitoring and auditing for the life of the project? Also, will the cost of the certificate be a barrier for smaller investors? So Tony, is there a cost to actually establishing the certificate?
A number of reports will be required of projects before they can apply for a certificate. There'll be some auditing required too, and there'll be a mix of monitoring activities required, which will be part of the approval for the project provided by the CER. There will also be a series of audit reports. The range of audit reports required, we're still working our way through now, but I guess we've worked on a rule of thumb that an audit report, which is, did you do what you said you would do to the required standard? We're working on a rule of thumb. It might cost about $10,000 per audit report to get that kind of conclusion. Now, an audit report is not the same as monitoring. An audit is a reconciliation of, these were the approval conditions you were given. Have you followed the right process in order to get there? They're not there to judge whether, if the 1,000 seedlings that you planted have all struck and all survived. That's a separate exercise.
Yeah, there are several questions on that, Tony, about how we'll establish the whether the market deliver what the certificates say they will. So we'll probably have to move on to the next speaker, Tony. But thanks very much for that fantastic overview. I'll just go to the next slide and mention that Tony has a further 8 additional slides which are packed with information as well, and they'll be made available to everybody as well. So it's really great, Tony, that the department is providing this information. Some of the questions that have been posed will be really for Carl around regulatory arrangements for that. Our second speaker today is Laura Waterford, who will talk about biodiversity credit markets. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you, Tony, for the update as well on the government side of things. It's really helpful to have that overview as a launching pad for what I'm going to speak to, which is really just to situate this conversation about the emerging nature repair market or nature repair scheme in Australia in the sort of broader conversation around carbon markets, firstly, but then also the global developments around what I think most people are calling voluntary biodiversity credit markets, but I might actually start there with a note on terminology, which is to say that terms like credits, offsets, and certificates are being used sort of somewhat interchangeably in this conversation around biodiversity markets at the moment. And so to the extent that I'm going to focus on using the language biodiversity credits today, aside from where I speak to the range of potential uses of biodiversity products on this slide, I'm going to use that term to refer to voluntary products that are not intended to be used to support offsetting claims, first of all, and that's in line with the intended use of the nature repair certificates under the federal government scheme as well. So putting aside the offsetting conversation. And I'm going to talk about biodiversity credits to mean usually a unitised approach, but also I think it's fair to say that the voluntary certificates to be issued under the nature repair scheme that the federal government's proposing, which are to be issued at the whole of project level, fit broadly into this conversation around voluntary biodiversity credit markets. And so scooping up all of the potential products that fit into that voluntary space when I'm stepping through some of the trends that we're seeing emerge. I think, first of all, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context around how this emerging market for biodiversity fits against existing compliance biodiversity offset requirements that have existed for a long time in many jurisdictions, including Australia, and also how this conversation sits alongside the nature-based solutions carbon market, because I think they're both really important things that have an intersection here and where we can learn quite a bit from how those markets have been administered and participated in by all stakeholders over the last few decades. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that for a long time we've had carbon markets operating in Australia and all over the world where there has been a premium paid for nature-based solutions carbon credits, and in Australia that's ACCUs, on the assumption to some degree that those credit types are likely to have a biodiversity co-benefit, whether that's measured or unmeasured. And for many years, I think that premium was payable on the assumption that those benefits likely existed. But over the last few years, there's been a bit of a trend towards buyers seeking a bit more clarity and confidence around those biodiversity co-benefits, and so pushing toward a measurement approach so that the primary product you're buying is certainly a carbon credit, but with the assurance of measured biodiversity outcomes alongside that to give confidence that that credit deserves the premium price that the market has been paying. So that's been bubbling along for many years, as has the offset biodiversity market in Australia, which exists primarily at the state level in a few different jurisdictions, where there are actually biodiversity units already traded to support the demand side meeting their compliance obligations, where they've, for example, undertaken a project that requires land clearing, and then under legislation they are required to offset that impact on biodiversity by purchasing a specified number and type of credits. What has happened in the last few years, really since 2020, is a conversation about, well, isn't there a niche here for voluntary biodiversity products? So where it's not necessarily tied to the negative impacts on biodiversity associated with a project, so it won't be caught by compliance requirements, and really where we can reward good biodiversity outcomes over and above wrapping that into what a buyer might be willing to pay for carbon. And there's a few reasons that conversation has come about. From a regulatory perspective, there is a significant focus on biodiversity coming down the line. So much more of a focus on corporates and financial institutions reporting on their nature impacts at the highest level, and that generally increasing scrutiny on where and how their operations intersect with biodiversity and nature in their direct operations and their supply chains. So suddenly nature's on the agenda in a way that it wasn't previously, and it's starting to kind of enter that conversation alongside climate at the board level. And in addition to that, I think the push towards starting to unitize biodiversity co-benefits has contributed as well. The push towards trying to measure those biodiversity co-benefits has pushed the conversation even slightly further towards unitization and a formal separate way of recognising those benefits as either a certificate or a credit. And the last piece of this puzzle, I think, is nature-based solutions carbon projects obviously need to be carried out in ecosystems where there is a carbon uplift achievable. And there are many ecosystems that we can have really good biodiversity outcomes for where that's just not possible. So desert ecosystems or coral reefs, for example. And so there's actually a gap in the ability to pull in private sector finance via carbon markets for those kinds of ecosystems at the moment. And so this is a niche that voluntary biodiversity credits can also start to fill. So sitting alongside nature-based solutions, carbon credits and biodiversity offsets, we now have this conversation around biodiversity credits happening. And I sort of alluded to this at the start, but to put a very fine point on it, the predominant discussion in the market around how voluntary biodiversity credits will be used is that they will not be used to support offsetting claims, and that is not set in stone, and there's still a lot of debate and discussion happening around that. And I don't say that that's where the market will be 10 years from now, but there is a hesitancy in the voluntary space at the moment to say that voluntary products could be used to achieve offsetting, because it's very challenging from a scientific perspective to really certify that scientific equivalence has been achieved, where you might have negative impacts in one location and positive impacts in another. And biodiversity is a very difficult thing to measure those outcomes for. So sticking with voluntary claims around contributing to positive outcomes and steering clear of offsets in that space. The last thing I just wanted to touch on before I move on to some more of the state of the market content is just the notion that you can actually stack carbon and biodiversity credits or combine them in different ways. There are some examples of these things happening in the market, or whether it's intended that it will be possible to do these things. And I actually think the intent with the nature repair certificates is that it will be possible to have those issued over the same land as land that is generating ACCUs. So in that instance, there'll be two separate products that have different claims attached to them in terms of the carbon and biodiversity outcomes. And there are other schemes globally that are looking at the same thing. And there's also schemes in the past that have combined a biodiversity credit issued in Australia with a carbon credit issued overseas. They've been stapled together and then sold as a product that has both a carbon and biodiversity benefit, but where those outcomes weren't achieved from the same project, which is quite an interesting and innovative model as well. So there are lots of moving parts to what this market will look like and how the voluntary biodiversity credit market intersects with offsets and with the carbon space. But I think there's a reasonable degree of sophistication of understanding around these different dynamics playing out as well. And in fairly short order, given this conversation around voluntary biodiversity credit markets really only commenced from 2020. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking to this world map, which probably by now needs updating again, because what this map represents is the proliferation of voluntary biodiversity credit schemes that have cropped up all over the world in the last few years. And each one of these bubbles is a scheme, not a project. So it is possible that these schemes have multiple pilot projects already going on in multiple locations and in geographies from which they haven't originated. And in fact, I know that that's true for several of them. But I think it's important to understand how quickly this is evolving and also how complicated the market's becoming from a global perspective, because each one of these schemes has slightly different approaches to the measurement of biodiversity, so what metrics they use, and then also all of the other features of a scheme that go to things like integrity or unitization. There are some broad tenets across all of the schemes that are emerging that are similar, and I'll get to that in a moment. We conducted a review of 8 of the leading schemes where there was the most publicly available information for us to use for that purpose last year. And there are some interesting findings that have come out of that. But just before I move on to that, from a geographic perspective, just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of the innovation in this space is actually coming out of Australia. I think we're well and truly on the radar in the global conversation, not least because of the nature repair scheme and the fact that our government has already passed that legislation. We were the first government globally to do that. I think New Zealand is the second most advanced government in terms of being out for consultation on potentially designing a scheme. But Australia's also got a couple of other voluntary schemes emerging. So there's the Nature Plus scheme, which seeks to issue nature-related voluntary units, and also the Wilderland scheme, which has had a couple of transactions that are well known in the market. And I think what's interesting is that even within Australia, within those schemes, if we think about the nature repair market, the Nature Plus scheme and the Wilderland scheme, each one of those voluntary products takes quite a different approach to how they would unitize and represent the biodiversity outcomes. So even within Australia, we have a really interesting microcosm to think about in terms of what products are likely to be best fit for what the buyer needs. What I wanted to give a sense of, because I think it's not necessarily intuitive to know easily what constitutes a biodiversity credit. For some of the reasons that I've mentioned before, there are different options around how we think about what metrics are relevant for biodiversity, different activity types that can either maintain or improve biodiversity values, and different areas and time periods that you can think about in terms of what a credit might represent. And so across the schemes that we looked at last year for that global review, we found that the common components were a clear articulation of what types of outcomes or activities the unit was seeking to achieve, and then usually an approach to unitisation that meant that the credit represented, for example, 1 metre or a hectare, and then the outcomes that were achieved over that area were achieved within a given period of time. And so this model that I'm speaking about now contemplates multiple issuances over a project life, so say every 5 years, if that's when the change in ecological conditions likely to be detectable, and that there would be multiple credits issued each of the same area. So multiple credits for 1 hectare of a project that might be 40 hectares. That is a bit different to the nature repair scheme that we've just heard about, in the sense that that is a single certificate issued at a single point in time. And that, I think, goes to support the sort of broader point, which is there's so much diversity emerging in the market, and we're not quite sure yet exactly how buyers will want to participate or what features of a product will be most attractive to them. But I think it's food for thought, and kind of goes to the point about the complexity for buyers in knowing what to buy and how supporting a project like this will align with their own objectives, whether that's targets that they've set or just a broader ambition to be able to articulate ESG credentials to the market that they have confidence in. The other really interesting thing to think about in terms of what is a biodiversity credit is what the metrics are that are being selected to measure, and therefore what claims can be made about what has been measured. So I've been referring broadly to this market as a biodiversity market, but biodiversity has a very broad definition, and there's certainly not universal agreement on what is important to measure within that context yet. And so across the schemes that we have looked at, they've taken broadly sort of 3 buckets of approaches to measurement. Some are focused on a whole of ecosystem perspective that can refer to that as a basket of metrics approach, where the standard specifies a range of metrics that need to be measured to get that whole of ecosystem perspective, and then the project proponent chooses from those metrics which are most appropriate for the ecosystem type. It's probably the most comprehensive approach that we've seen. There's also an approach around really focusing on specific habitat attributes for a given species. So, for example, koala habitat. So that might consist of looking at vegetation, condition and extent metrics, but then overlaying on top of that the specific factors that are relevant for koala habitat, with or without measurement of the presence, absence or abundance of the species itself. And then the last category is just a focus on vegetation. So really just thinking about condition and extent as a proxy for the other biodiversity values that might exist within an ecosystem. So if you look top to bottom on that table, really what that represents is varying cost in terms of measurement, reporting and verification, and varying degrees of confidence in terms of the outcomes that are delivered from a whole of ecosystem perspective. And this is another one of those things where I would just say we don't know yet what the demand side is most interested in or prepared to pay for. Are they going to be satisfied with vegetation, condition and extent as a proxy for biodiversity outcomes? Are they really going to want to know how each part of an ecosystem is performing? And will that push us up into the ecosystem whole of basket of metrics approach? And will they be willing to pay for that? Because MRV is one of the significant considerations, or the cost of MRV is one of the significant considerations in terms of how credits will be priced in the market, at least for the first few years. Just some higher order trends, kind of moving beyond what is a credit now and what are the considerations around how you would design a credit. In that review that we have done of the 8 schemes that were emerging, there were a few really big trends, and I think it's interesting to reflect on those in the context of the nature repair scheme as well. The first one was that most of the schemes that we looked at were really focused on terrestrial ecosystems. Some of them had an ambition to be applicable to other ecosystem types, but didn't actually have methodologies to support measurement for ecosystems that were freshwater or marine, for example. But it's really good to hear that the nature repair scheme has been set up to comprehend all of those different ecosystem types. Second was a lot of the schemes had articulated an approach to engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities, but there was a significant amount of interest kind of in our conversations in the market about maybe elevating that conversation beyond benefit sharing and free, prior and informed consent into more of a position around pursuing ownership, for example, or an equity position for IPs and LCs. So elevating away from thinking of them as stakeholders more towards owners is a really big theme in this market. It's also quite innovative approaches coming through to solve for the challenge of permanence, or rather to do away with that concept, in the sense that in carbon markets and in the ACCU market in Australia, we've got crediting periods followed by a lengthy permanence period to try to ensure that we're able to preserve the benefits that a project's achieved. But during that permanence period, obviously there are no payments flowing to the landholder, and it's kind of yet to be seen how that will come out in the wash. But what some of the schemes that we're seeing emerge in the voluntary biodiversity space are doing is actually allowing for indefinite crediting. So if you can line up a buyer who wants to purchase credits from your project in perpetuity, which probably won't be realistic on day one, but or you can find multiple buyers, I suppose, over time that are interested in the product. There's actually no end to the project life, which means that there'll be a continuous, or there is at least the potential for a continuous revenue stream to support the ongoing management of biodiversity, which I think is a really important and interesting evolution in how we think about the permanence requirements as compared to carbon markets. The fourth is also kind of a question of whether or not we follow the same trend for biodiversity markets as we have for carbon markets around additionality. So it's been very hard historically for some countries or types of land to participate in carbon markets. So, for example, protected areas and countries with high forest cover and low rates of deforestation haven't met the historical additionality tests that have been in place in carbon markets. But I think that there is thinking that perhaps that approach is not as applicable in the context of biodiversity, because we need to manage biodiversity, as in people need to be in landscapes ensuring that biodiversity values are maintained, or they will go backwards. And there's actually really good data for that in the context of national parks, where we know that often if they're not sufficiently funded, biodiversity values are actually going backwards. And so there is an argument from a financial additionality perspective to say that we should be able to think about a role for voluntary biodiversity projects in even national parks, if that additional finance is going to mean that we're able to maintain or enhance biodiversity values that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And then the last couple are not really concerns for the nature repair scheme. I think the nature repair scheme's been very clear about its intent around these two, but some of the other emerging schemes that are not government-led, they are at the moment in the position of being both standard and project developer, which raises some questions around integrity. And so I think in the next few years, we'll see a lot of those schemes that are emerging and currently in piloting phase move on to a position where actually standards administered by an independent body. But the nature repair scheme's been obviously set up that way with government as administrator, so that's not a problem. And then some more transparency as well, I think, from some of the schemes that we looked at that were not government-led, around exactly how they were going to track their projects, for example, and what information would be made publicly available. But again, the nature repair scheme's been very clear on that in terms of the registry and some of the other functions that the CER will perform. So I don't think that's a concern with respect to the nature repair scheme. So that's it from me in terms of the global trends. But Ian, I don't know if we have time for a couple of questions.
No, thank you. We do have some questions. In fact, there's hundreds of questions online, Laura, and a lot of those questions relate to additionality that you were talking about. For example, that there's co-benefits to carbon investment, but there'll be co-benefits to certificates as well. How do you see that all playing out?
Yeah. I'm not sure the co-benefits question relates specifically to the concept of additionality, but I would acknowledge that definitely certificates will have co-benefits, social co-benefits and First Nations co-benefits in many cases, depending on the project design. And I think that capturing that value is going to be really important, but we need to tread really carefully and be led by First Nations as to how they would like to articulate that, think about it, and whether or not they want to capture that as economic value. A lot of the work that we're doing is in that space, thinking about how traditional owners can participate in and help to shape these markets in a way that they feel is culturally appropriate. And I don't think that we're going to have an answer to that, or a mainstream answer to that in the very near future. But I certainly agree it's something that project proponents need to be really mindful of, and certainly probably move beyond just engagement with traditional owners into bringing them into project design and asking the question genuinely about equity ownership, as I sort of flagged as a macro trend in this space.
You mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot of different markets emerging, different models emerging, and an interesting question is how they'll run in parallel. And a question that Paul Elton asked is about whether the Commonwealth itself could invest substantially in the certificates, whether that could emerge.
I think others on this call will probably have views about this, but my understanding is that the Commonwealth has the power under the legislation to purchase the certificates if it were to so choose, but that it hasn't actually signalled a policy position that would suggest that that's the intent in the short term, at least.
Good. Thanks very much for that, Laura. We'd better move on to our next speaker. But as I said, there are hundreds of questions online, and they're really detailed and very interesting. If you want to have a look at those, and we'll work at getting answers to as many of those as we can post seminar. But now, Gillian, we'll move to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Well, look, I might just start by observing that the establishment of the nature repair market is part of a broader trend in Australia of setting up market-based schemes to help us achieve policy objectives. So we've got the ACCU scheme set up to help us on our climate targets, LGC trading to help us with our renewable energy goals. And there are also moves afoot to establish a guarantee of origin scheme for hydrogen and renewable energy, and a vehicle emissions standard trading scheme. And, from a corporate perspective, which is often the perspective I look at these markets through, they're not the be all and end all of helping organisations navigate their way through to net zero or to contributing to nature positivity, but they supply a really important tool to organisations with ESG goals to leverage the governance and integrity and oversight that is embedded in those schemes to then support their net zero and nature positive objectives and the claims they want to make publicly. So in that sense, and as a broad overarching observation, the establishment of this nature repair market is potentially a big step forward to supporting businesses to adopt nature positive strategies. And also, a tool available to have some comfort that there's robustness underpinning the projects and proper governance to oversee long-term management of land. So we are seeing interest from clients in this market. And some of the questions that are coming up are, how does this compare with the ACCU market? How does this compare with biodiversity offsetting schemes? And where can we play in this market, and what are some of the legal issues that we might encounter? So those are the topics I wanted to step through briefly. And I'll start by situating the market within the context of the ACCU market, building on some similar comments that I think Laura made. So there are some familiar elements to this scheme. The first and obvious one is that the Nature Repair Act provides that projects can be registered if they are consistent with a government-approved methodology. So in the climate space, the two classes of methodologies are avoidance methodologies and sequestration methodologies. In the nature context, there'll be enhancement methods and protection methods. Both regimes provide for the relinquishment of certificates if there's a reversal event, or in the case of nature repair, a significant reversal event. Something to observe perhaps in the nature space is that whereas in ACCU land, if there is a loss of carbon stores due to a fire, the extent of relinquishment can be scaled to the loss of carbon stores, whereas in the biodiversity market, as there's only one certificate per project, relinquishment is very much an all or nothing affair, which perhaps could make that as something that's regarded as a more significant risk than in the ACCU space. The nature repair market also borrows concepts around additionality and permanence periods of 25 and 100 years. I guess from a regulatory system design perspective, it's smart to borrow concepts that have been road tested in the market and that we know work. But the correlations between the two regimes will also potentially be helpful in terms of the stacking of projects that Laura mentioned before. So the correlation of permanence periods, for example, may be facilitative of that stacking opportunity. So turning to the differences, as I mentioned, the biggest practical difference will be that the project under the nature repair scheme will create one large monolithic biodiversity certificate, which will be issued at a single point in time. And so those units aren't going to be highly commodified, unitized, and fungible. And that's a big difference from the ACCU market, where, of course, that projects can generate a stream of ACCUs, which are sort of highly fungible units, and where it's easy to obtain, relatively easy to obtain good price discovery. So, there may be some limits to the liquidity of the biodiversity certificate market. So that challenge could also stimulate some creativity in how market participants use these units. So I observed that there is the ability to deposit a biodiversity certificate with the CER for safekeeping. You don't relinquish ownership of it, but you can post it with them for safekeeping. So, one potential concept would be for a carbon aggregator to place their biodiversity certificate for their carbon project with the CER for safekeeping, and then perhaps look at the opportunity to use that as a form of co-benefit certification rather than trading the unit itself. I think we'll also look to the banks and other clever innovators in this space to see whether they look at opportunities to unitize or tokenize these units through their own means, given that the government scheme itself doesn't allow for further unitization within a project. Another absolutely key difference, which we've touched on, is that there isn't a mandatory market for biodiversity certificates, because the use of biodiversity certificates is not allowed for offsetting, and that's a key contrast point with ACCUs, which can be relinquished for safeguard mechanism compliance purposes. And as we've discussed, there is the statutory architecture for the government to come in and become a major source of demand for biodiversity certificates, but again, there's no policy on foot to do so, and that's a big point of difference with the ACCU market, where many millions of dollars have been funded into the market through the Emissions Reduction Fund. So another key comparison is with the biodiversity offset markets, which are already operating in states. And as many of you will already know, when a project is carried out which has an impact on ecological values, in many cases, environmental offsets will be required, potentially both under state law and under our national environmental law, the EPBC Act. And even when those offsets are required to comply with the EPBC approval, which is a federal approval, we tend to turn to state biodiversity offset markets to satisfy those requirements. So it's an interesting and maybe slightly perverse result of prohibiting the use of nature repair market certificates under the EPBC Act for offsetting, that we will continue to use these state-based offset markets, and these state-based offset markets will continue to operate alongside our national nature repair scheme. So the coexistence of those markets will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how much the nature repair market machinery, so the methodologies, for example, borrow from what's already been learnt from the offset methodologies that are in place. So just to go into a bit more detail, in Victoria, in our offsetting market, there's generally a requirement for a 10-year activity period, followed by the land needing to be protected in perpetuity. So permanence period in the nature repair market is certainly not in perpetuity. There is a limit to it. But if a company is undertaking a nature repair market project and wants to make claims about absolute permanence, they might borrow a piece of our state offsetting architecture and place, for example, a conservation covenant on the land so that they can make that green claim that the land is protected in perpetuity. More differences in the state schemes. We have like-for-like requirements, and in some cases proximity requirements between the offset and the project. So in nature repair, there isn't this underlying like-for-like or proximity requirements, but we may nevertheless see buyer preferences emerging around some sort of more appealing subject matters like the Great Barrier Reef protection, or charismatic species like koalas or greater guide gliders. And in some cases, we may see organisations having a preference for biodiversity certificates that are generated on land that is proximate to where they're active, even though that's not a strict requirement. Before moving on to the next topic, I think the other thing to observe is that there will likely be ongoing competition in terms of access to land with natural capital potential between these two markets. So a well-informed landholder may well already have been in touch with their local biodiversity offset broker and may have a good understanding of their opportunities in the pre-existing biodiversity offset markets. And so it's something to keep in mind for those moving into the nature repair market, that there could well be this competition from these separate offset markets. So another question clients are asking themselves is, where do we fit into the market ecosystem? And apart from sort of furnishing the opportunity for a bit of a cheesy pun in the heading there, I do think it's an important thing for organisations to reflect on. And in particular, for potential sort of corporates looking to go into the market from an ESG perspective, it is worth considering whether they have the ability or the willingness to build up the capability and resources to become proponents of these projects, or whether they can support these projects by supplying, for example, access to their land estate, supplying capital, maybe even buying into a project proponent that's aggregating projects across the country, and perhaps even just making sure that they've got security of offtake. So it's not necessarily the case that if an organisation wants to be a participant in the market, that they need to rush straight into being a project proponent. And in many cases, organisations might consider an iterative approach where they participate in one of these ways before moving in the future into becoming a proponent themselves. So the key legal considerations for market participants. Look, I've mapped out here some of the key legal considerations. The cluster on the left are more of the governance type considerations, and the cluster on the right are more sort of project level considerations. From a head office perspective, organisations are now increasingly looking at how their directors and officers are discharging their duties of care and diligence to manage and mitigate nature-related risks. So in moving into nature repair markets, it will be important to think about how these activities tie into and support the organisation and its leaders' management of those risks and opportunities. I can't emphasise enough the greenwashing point. Most greenwashing activity of late has focused on climate-related marketing materials and representations to shareholders and investors. But shareholders are already, and NGOs are already turning their focus to nature-related greenwashing. And ASIC and ACCC, I have no doubt, will follow suit shortly. So having checks in place to ensure that representations or green claims that are made on the back of nature repair market participation will be really important. I think the other one I've put there is compliance pathway. I came off the phone this morning with a large organisation that's putting together a compliance pathway for their participation in and origination of carbon farming projects. And that will look at all sorts of things from native title through to land use approvals, through to fraud risk management and so on. And that will enable central risk management and compliance teams to take comfort that if it's rolled out with the project origination team and there's a checklist in place, that the company's overall compliance management situation will be appropriately managed. I mean, that type of pathway can be picked up and applied in the nature repair market, and from a governance perspective can help manage risks as organisations move into nature repair space. Turning more to the project side, obviously there'll be a need to give thought to how the deal will be structured and who brings what resources and skills to the project, how the activities are financed, what time horizons the participants will work together, and so on. And as I mentioned before, there's similar deal structures that are already happening in the carbon market that we can be picking up and adjusting for nature repair. Site due diligence will also be important, and legal site due diligence might include looking at whether the project will impact native title or cultural heritage and what approvals will be required from traditional owners. It will also be important to look at whether the land already has encumbrances like existing conservation covenants or biodiversity maintenance areas, or restrictive covenants, easements, leases to third parties that have an inconsistent use of land in mind, and so on. And inquiries can be also made about the landholder themselves and what, if they are to be a proponent, whether they are a fit and proper person. So in some cases, we have encountered this already, companies or proponents of infrastructure projects that already have mandatory offsetting requirements under their EPBC approval or other approvals are interested in the opportunity of setting aside a larger piece of land than is required under their approval and then using that extra bit for the voluntary markets. And there's certainly nothing stopping that. And in fact, it could be quite a good outcome because it will reduce edge effect potentially, could create habitat corridors, could sort of help support larger breeding colonies within a larger area. So there's potentially something to suggest itself there. Although the challenge will be that because the nature repair market can't be used for offsetting, you could have one contiguous piece of land that's holistically managed, but there's an invisible line through the middle, with one side being managed under state offsetting laws and the other being managed under the nature repair market. So a fair bit of sort of admin to take care of making sure those are integrated carefully. And the other piece to call out is, of course, putting in place measures, principally backed up by contract, but also through technical means to manage key project risks. And the obvious one is the risks around reversal events, but also things like the risk of land changing hands, the risk of misleading information going to the clean energy regulator, and so on. So I list those things not to suggest that this is hard and difficult and impossible. And in fact, our experience in the biodiversity offset space and the carbon trading space is that these are very manageable and achievable things to do. And it's just a matter of working through them as you go into the market. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Gillian. If you go to your next slide, it's got your contact details there. And there's a lot of questions again. Quite a few questions about permanence, Gillian, about is there a time frame for these certificates, or are they in perpetuity?
That is a really interesting question. So the certificates will continue to exist until the underlying project is completed. So if it's a 25-year project, the certificate will come to an end in 25 years. And if it's a 100-year project, it will come to an end in 100 years. The other point to make is that if the underlying project is deregistered, my understanding is that the certificate is also deregistered. So that sort of unbundling from the underlying land and the project isn't perhaps as complete as we see in the ACCU market.
Thanks. There's also a series of questions there about cost and complexity. Do you think that this will mean that really there are scale limits to the projects that can actually go ahead here, because there's so much probity and regulatory cost that it only works for very large project areas?
I think that it is an interesting observation. You know, the flip side of all this fantastic governance and integrity is that the cost and complexity in getting a project up may be higher than perhaps looking at a less evolved scheme. So it's certainly something that we've seen where we've been approached by clients that simply just want to get on with a project. They're getting, for example, pressure from head office abroad to get trees in the ground and do it quickly. And we've sort of, you know, it is a consideration that if there's a small scale planting project that an organisation wants to carry out with the local CMA, will it be the right fit to look to have this registered under the scheme, given all the delay and cost that might bring with it? There may well be projects that are of a smaller scale and where there's a sort of an impatience to get going, where it will be appropriate for organisations to look at other options.
And a final one, Julie, and this might be one for Laura as well. When you look back on this scheme in 10 years' time, do you think that the new certificate process is a game changer amongst all the other investment opportunities that you've talked about?
That is an interesting question. I do see it as a game changer. There's the signalling to Australian business that this is a credible activity for them to participate in. There is the creation of a secure unit that isn't just sitting on an administrative registry, it is sitting on a legislative registry, and it has the backing of, you know, the Constitution. If it's unjustly taken from you through legislative change, then you're entitled to compensation. I mean, that's a big thing in terms of gaining the confidence of investors and signalling that this is something that can be invested in with some degree of confidence. There's aspects of it that I think are a little bit clunky, and you know, over the course of 10 years, I don't think I'd be surprised if we saw the architecture evolve somewhat to make it more investable. But I do see it as a step change in terms of how we look at nature markets. Laura?
Laura?
I think we probably would just have the same response almost. I guess what I would say is that one thing investors love is regulatory certainty. And so having a government-backed voluntary scheme is a step change for Australia. It's also a step change globally. As I said, Australia is the first government to have come out and legislated for that. So I think it is a bit of a trailblazing move. The question will be, as Gillian alluded to, whether or not the product architecture currently is going to support the demand side in the way that kind of makes sense for them to be able to make claims about the products that are consistent with the types of reporting that they're going to need to be doing under the TNFD and things like that. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about exactly how it will play out from the demand side, but I think it is like a bold move in terms of having a government-backed scheme that rightly be called a step change.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Gillian as well. So, Carl, we'll move to you now from the view from the regulator.
Great, thanks, Ian. Could I also just start by acknowledging country? I'm here on Ngunnawal country at the turn of the season, always a beautiful time of year here in Canberra. And just acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and particularly just acknowledge all the Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people who have joined the call, and just reflect, how important this work is and how important we create pathways for First Nations participation, and acknowledge country and heritage and traditional ecological knowledge in everything that we do. Also just wanted to say it's incredible to see 250 people on the call. I scanned through the list. There are a couple of old friends for me, but more excitingly, there are so many new people. And if we just go to the next slide, Ian, I'm just going to very briefly reflect on the role of the CER in the market. And I'll try and do that fairly briefly because Tony and others have sort of covered the ground, and there's much more to discover than we know today. And so then I'll reflect a little bit on what I think some of the opportunities and challenges sort of moving forward are, and reflecting on, I just think this is an incredible opportunity, but it's also another step on a long journey. And I'd like to call out and acknowledge sort of people who've been working in this space for decades in some cases, some of whom are on the call today. So just turning briefly to the next slide and the role of the regulator. Our role is to administer the market, and to do so in a way that has transparency, integrity, and underpins the fact that products that are being produced are property and can be traded, and create a platform and a register through which things can be traded. So at the regulator, we look after a range of environmental markets, as I'm sure people are aware. So we look after the safeguard mechanism, we look after ACCUs, we look after the renewable energy target. We're doing the foundational work for guarantee of origin, and we will leverage all of that existing infrastructure. And so that allows us to register people, register projects, assess applications against a methodology, as Tony has outlined, issue certificates, register those certificates, enable them to be traded, and allow information to flow about those projects. And as I talk through some of the opportunities and challenges, I think we'll shine a light on, there's a lot in each of those functions. And for us, there's also just a lot of foundational work that needs to be done to ensure that our IT systems work, that our IT systems are secure, that the registry is functional, that the certificates can be lodged, they can be held securely as a financial product, etc., etc. And so we're busy sort of building those foundations sort of currently. If we move to the next slide. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the nature of the opportunity, and maybe building on the earlier conversation, reflecting that I do think this is potentially a game changer. I've sort of been reflecting a little bit as someone who's sort of involved in writing about biodiversity, conservation and private land stewardship right back in the early 1990s. And there's lots of things that we're building upon here. So one of the first things is to remember that we have tens or hundreds of thousands of land stewards in Australia, and they have a existing suite of responsibilities and a stewardship function as it stands today. Back then in the 90s, we talked about the duty of care that a landowner has to be a responsible steward of biodiversity. Then running alongside that, you had lots of people involved in private lands conservation, be it the covenanting organisations like Trust for Nature or Bush Heritage Fund, Australian Wildlife Conservancy. The US's Nature Conservancy also came to Australia. And then you had a whole community movement, bush care, land care, a whole bunch of related activities. And in and amongst all that, you've had tens of thousands of land managers in one way or another involved in private lands stewardship. And reflecting back on all that, I think there's a dilemma in that we need to create property, we need to unitise, we need to make it fungible, and we need to ensure that it's seen and valued across society and through businesses. Hence, the creation of a more formalised market and certificates is a good idea. But it is hard, and sitting underneath that, we need active, proactive management, active stewards who are looking to improve biodiversity outcomes every day. And I wanted to start just by reflecting that those two things aren't entirely comfortable bedfellows. So if you ask someone who does something voluntarily and then you commoditise it, you unleash a range of dynamics that can actually get quite difficult to manage. But nevertheless, I think it's an absolutely necessary step because it gives the opportunity for biodiversity to be recognised and valued in the marketplace. And we can see that it's important, as others have said, because carbon markets are starting to discriminate. So they're looking for nature-based solutions. They're looking for First Nations and Indigenous participation. They're looking for mechanisms by which other products, including food supply chains, can recognise other values that land managers deliver and their delivery of ecosystem services. And so ideally, if we think about this from a land manager's point of view, they will have on a single set of land a set of accounts from which they can create a whole bunch of different rights, whether it be biodiversity, cultural heritage rights through First Nations participation, sustainable and certified food products, etc. I think, though, the opportunity in the next 10 to 15 years will be dominated by the presence of carbon as the big financial driver in this marketplace. So as the world grapples with the climate challenge and carbon increasingly is recognised and has a price and has markets to trade in, people will start to look for multiple benefit. And how we start and modify a market with that large driving force sitting in behind it, I think is one of the things that we need to discover over the next 10 years or so. I'm really encouraged by the issuing of biodiversity certificates. I think it's a start, but not an end point, but that's often the way these things go. And so I sort of had the last dot point on this slide around from little things, big things grow. So I don't think the market is anywhere near mature. I don't think between Tony's team and my team that are working incredibly closely with one another, I don't think we're going to be able to answer all the questions. I don't think we're going to deliver, a fully mature marketplace on day one. But what we are going to do is create the possibility that people who are sitting outside of natural areas can participate in the protection and management of those natural areas and be recognised for doing so. And I think over time, those participants, as well as governments, will then learn, modify, refine, and further mature a marketplace. And I think that's the best way of thinking about this step of the journey. Let's go to the next slide. So the challenges, one of the big challenges is we've elected, I think perhaps wisely, not to unitise. So there isn't a unit of biodiversity credit. There is a biodiversity credit that is aligned to a certificate. So in trying to sort of communicate this, and I think it already has been done so, but are you a Van Gogh person or a Fred Williams person or Kalani Heel? I'm not quite sure who that is. Must be an emerging artist. Each of the pictures has got their own beauty. Each of them has got a different origin and a different history, a whole bunch of different attributes about it, and are presumably worth different amounts of money. And sitting within that analogue or that metaphor of the paintings, there are a whole number of questions. How do we register what the attributes of a biodiversity certificate are? Are those attributes codified, legislated, verified, with compliance monitored? Or are there other attributes of projects where a claim is essentially made by a project owner or a project proponent, but they're subject to verification of the purchaser, in the same way that when you buy a car, you have to do your own verification around what you're buying. And if we look at the carbon market and how it's currently evolving, we are starting to see some small differentials in the market around pricing for different types of Australian carbon credit units. So those that have First Nations participation, some of the Savannah projects up north, for example, attract a reasonable premium in the marketplace. We also have project owners making a whole range of claims around why their projects might be better or differentiated from others. And then at the other end of the spectrum, on the demand side, we have purchasers who are vitally interested in assuring themselves that the projects that they become involved with generate Australian carbon credit units that they are incredibly comfortable with and proud to be associated with. And on the other hand, there are organisations on the demand side who are simply seeking a unit of carbon that is certified by government that can be utilised for compliance purposes. And so there's a whole myriad of issues embedded in that story of what is a certificate, what are its attributes, what's it worth, how's it registered, what information do we log around that, and what are the things that we're verifying versus what are the things that a buyer and seller need to negotiate between themselves. Another huge challenge is clearly verifying outcomes. I think the only observation I'd make today is that a regulator operating in isolation is either going to have an extraordinarily large staff or is going to have to rely on others in one way or another. I think we need to take a pragmatic approach, particularly in the early stages of the formation of the market. And I think there is a huge untapped resource in our existing landholder networks and also a wide range of our community organisations. And so I think that will be quite interesting to see how that maps out. The final, second last sort of challenge that I wanted to highlight is one of the most important things when you are beginning to form a market is we need people to participate. And so I regularly put myself in the position of thinking through, if I was a land manager, how would I react to this? Do I need a professional broker to support me in developing a biodiversity project? Or is it something that I could take on my own? How does this integrate with the verification I'm doing for the food and fibre products that I'm selling into the marketplace? How does it relate to the carbon project that I just entered into? Can we align our administration? Can we align our reporting? Can we align compliance and audit services so they operate seamlessly? All of these things are sort of not insignificant barriers. So I think there are many things we could think through and seek to codify if we are going to try and create, if you like, the perfect marketplace. And at the other bookend, there would be a strategy around, I suppose, letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I suppose based on sort of lived experience, I would say the answer obviously lies a little bit in the middle. We need some clear guardrails so that people can be assured that when they participate and when they purchase, that they are buying a commodity, if you like, that has genuine value. And on the other hand, we need to resist making the process so complex that it becomes impossible to participate. So I might sort of just finish the last dot point, sorry, on market formation. I think imagining and envisaging what the trading platforms are and how we bring buyers and sellers together, what that marketplace looks like and how it functions, and supporting a variety of different ways in which people can trade. And one of the things that we are currently doing with our registries is seeking to modernise those registries so that various trading platforms can put APIs into the registry to enable very efficient trading, marketing and settlement of these things. And whilst that's all fairly administrative stuff, it's incredibly important in getting functioning liquid and deep markets over time. So I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carl. We haven't got much time, but there's a bunch of questions that really relate to the point that you made about really commodification, the danger of making everything transactional. This and a question by Paul Moxon, for example, arguing that this whole commodification is really the opposite almost of an indigenous view of value. Are we in the process of really if you think about the whole land care movement and how that's transformed a lot of the landscape in a voluntary sense, are we in danger of commodifying this so much that we'll sort of degrade a lot of the values that underpin a lot of the work we've seen over the last decades?
Well, I don't think government and I don't think corporate Australia are ever going to be able to afford the full cost of biodiversity conservation. And so the engagement and encouragement of individual landowners to take self-directed action is going to remain incredibly important. And there's a very long and proud history of that in Australia, as I talked about earlier. And I think the interaction between that and if you like, a commoditised market is one of the more difficult things to navigate. And so, in an ideal world, we want those two markets to be highly complementary to one another. And it probably also plays into this issue around additionality, and that biodiversity has got that sort of unique attribute of requiring proactive and ongoing management. And so all I could really do is acknowledge that those tensions exist. And I would underscore, I don't think that's a reason not to create a marketplace, because a marketplace creates an opportunity for those who otherwise couldn't participate to participate and be recognised for their contribution. So I think it's an incredibly part of the mix, but I don't think it's the whole story.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. And I'd just like to invite you to come to next week's seminars, where we'll talk more about this whole the biodiversity and aspects of this issue. I would just like to thank, though, our speakers today, Tony, Laura, Gillian and Carl, for their generosity. Thanks, everybody, for coming along. We'll send this video out to everybody, along with as many answers to the 50 or so questions that we can muster. Thanks again for coming along, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.